Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Dalen. I work at the Douglas Stewart Company as an emerging technology specialist. The last few months, I've been heavily researching the CARES Act funding for education, really getting deep into the specific numbers and how much each school district will be getting and state. So I'm excited to share some of the insight I have on this complicated topic.
And I'm Dr. Rita Oates from Oates Associates. I'm someone who has been both a district tech director, where I was highly successful in writing grants, as well as a collaborator with folks in other places in writing grants or in evaluating them. I do a lot of workshops and sessions, webinars on finding funding. And so this is just a very tiny piece of the kind of work that I can do.
Hey everyone, my name is Patty LeBlanc and I am a full professor at Southeastern University and have collaborated with a number of different people, including Dr. Oates, on a variety of grants, and I just have some stories to share on some of the things that I've learned as I've written and administered grants. I also teach a grant writing course if you're interested at Southeastern.
Wonderful. Well, we can get into the presentation here. So if everyone in the audience wants to click the magnifying glass on the top right of the screen, or they can go to the top of your Verbella page and zoom in on the middle screen. So I'm going to start it off by talking about the CARES Act funding for education. So as you are all well aware, on March 25th, the Senate passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act for short. This was a $2 trillion stimulus package, and it reserved just over $30 billion for education. There were 4 major funds that were set up with the stimulus package, and I'll quickly walk through each of these just to give you an overview. They're complicated, but hopefully I'll be able to simplify it for you guys. So the first is the Elementary and Secondary School Education Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER for short. This fund earmarks just over $13 billion for state education agencies, local education agencies, so school districts, and also private schools. It's distributed based on the proportion of Title I funding the school gets. So if they receive 1% of Title I funding out of the state, they'll get 1% of the CARES ESSER funding. It's distributed on a reimbursable basis. So this means that as the money is spent by the schools, they'll have to apply to get reimbursed that money. And the funds can also be retroactively applied to this March 13th, and they won't expire till September of 2022. Now, the ESSER funds can really be spent on almost any resources necessary to address school needs. The guidelines in the bill are quite broad. So there are many different ways this money can be used. Some of them are professional development, hardware for learning from home. So it's really vague. So this money can be spent on almost anything. The next is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. This one is about $14 billion, and it's reserved for higher education institutes and colleges. It is distributed based 75% on their enrollment of full-time Pell students and 25% on total enrollment. This fund, 50% must be given towards students for financial aid. That is the only requirement of this fund. So if a college gets $1 million, $500,000 has to go to students. My brother is actually a student at UW La Crosse in Wisconsin, and they gave him $1,000 just direct payment. And then the other 50% can really be used for anything that the colleges need to address any of the COVID-19 related costs. The third one is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GERF for short. This is a $3 billion fund. With this one, the governor and the State Department really are going to dictate where this money goes. It's reserved for economic and educational entities that have significant unmet needs. So if the ESSER funding is not enough, that is where the GERF funding would come in, and that is by the governor's and state department's discretion. And the GERF funding can also be spent on any resources necessary to address school needs. The last major fund that was set up is the Rethink K-12 Schools Grant. This was a grant competition that just recently ended at the end of June, and it was $180 million. This grant was for technology, virtual learning, and remote education. It was really meant to find new ways to provide education in this time of distance learning. So I just want to give you guys, get a lot of questions about exactly what schools are going to be spending this money on. So this is a table from Clark County School District in Nevada. They're one of the top 10 largest school districts in the US. And as you can see, the ESSER funds are going to be used for hardware, Chromebook initiatives, software, LMS platforms, even professional development they're going to be spending it on. One of the major ones that I thought was quite interesting is the PPE. That's $15 million they're going to be using for PPE for next school year. And you think about that, that's over $41,000 a day on just PPE. So we really got to take into account how much it's going to cost for schools to reopen and if they're prepared for that. The other question I get a lot is there future funding coming? And the answer is yes. There is going to be another stimulus bill passed. I'm sure you've seen about it in the news a lot recently. The current Republican proposal is for a $1 trillion package with $150 billion set aside for schools. So that's 5 times more than the CARES Act provided. There's going to be a lot of aid coming for schools. I'm pretty confident it'll be passed before the end of August when the Democrats and Republicans hold their national conventions. They'll both want to go into that having some ammo to show how well that their parties are doing. So expect that to be passed by the end of August. I also get asked a lot about how this compares to the 2007 Great Recession. There are some similarities, but there's really a big difference between the COVID-19 recession. So the 2007 was caused by underlying fundamentals to our economy, and this recession is more due to a natural disaster, you could say. So it is going to be similar, but hopefully it won't take as long for us to recover from it. Thank you, and if you guys have any other questions on CARES Act funding, I'll be going around. I also have some data I can share if you guys have any specific school districts you're wanting me to look up. So feel free to come and find me.
Thank you so much. Rita, if you're ready, we can talk a little bit more about where else schools could look to find funding.
Super. And if you want to go ahead and advance the slides and go ahead and do one more, there we go. And Daylon's covered an awful lot very quickly and very capably of funding that's a huge amount of money with an awful lot of question marks. And the one thing I would add is that there's rules that came from the federal government, but how states are operationalizing the rules are not the same from state to state. So unfortunately, if you are selling into more than one state, you've got to get down in the weeds in more than one state, but you may be used to that already. So I want to very quickly just talk about a couple of things that are in my 10-minute slot here. And one is how vendors can help schools or districts. Where are a couple of great places to find grants and to get help? And then very specifically looking at local opportunities. And so I'd say the next slide, please. And so there are a couple of things that vendors can do to really help schools and districts in their seeking funding. And these are things that different vendors are in fact doing and doing with very good success. One is providing information that grant writers can plug into the grants. And that may be some short descriptions of your products. Very powerful to have links to research studies that use your product. If the research studies that you did and paid for that's okay. If it's an externally created research study, that's gold. And some research studies that are done are not widely found, and so it's, if you can help the grant writer by doing this little bit of legwork for them, it's just, I can't speak to you how important it is. If you find some specific grant competitions that your products qualify for, great to put information about that on your site, or to make sure that your potential customers or customers who want to expand know about that. You may want to offer a webinar that might be about funding sources, about new competitions, or even about how others purchased your product. And I would also say, offer a match when districts are submitting grants. So many grants want to have matching funds, and that may be a one-for-one match that's required. It may be something more or less than that. I know that there's one grant when I worked in Dade County Schools where I was in charge of educational technology. I wrote one grant where I had $2.50 matched for every dollar I was asking for, by some pretty creative ways of the folks I was working with in the district. And that put us at the absolute head of the list to get the funding. So that's important. It may be that you're selling training, and so you throw in some extra training days, or you throw in something else that they can put as a match when they're submitting the grant. And Patty's had a huge amount of experience in working with various vendors on ways to provide those matches so that you can move forward. And then if some of you are using crowdfunding sites or watching what's going on crowdfunding sites, you might offer a match or find a way to support teacher interest. There are some vendors who are offering, if you write a crowdfunding request on Donors Choose or one of the other sites, we'll match it 1-for-1, or we'll find a way to help you with that. Or it may be more informal, where you're just monitoring folks who are asking for something and maybe helping them get over the finish line. So those are just a few things. And if we can go on to the next slides, we've got some examples of these. And I'm not seeing anything on that slide. Let's see. So this is from BrainPop, and they have listed some effectiveness studies showing different ways of using their product and how it fosters learning made from different people, made from different organizations, including at least one that they themselves have done. And then next slide. And Mackin has something they call the Grant Channel. They sell basically to media centers, library media centers, and so they are focused on grants for library media centers that they post on their site, and they do a little monthly newsletter that they shoot out to their customers about different things so that they're aware, and they've done this legwork for their customers, and this is something their customers appreciate a lot. You can see they have featured grants, ongoing grants, and grant tips on their site. Next slide. Let's see. This is an example from Kajit. This is an old email where they were talking about a grants guide at a conference. They've actually updated it since this original email, so instead of 99 grants, it's 123 grants, and it's a pretty simple, it's not going into a lot of detail on the grants, but at least it's doing a little bit of legwork to help folks looking for ed tech funds. Next slide, please. Just wanted to give you an example of some ways that some different folks are doing this. Connection has a webinar series where they've talked specifically about E-rate funding and about STEM funding, STEAM funding, a lot about federal funds in their ongoing series that they co-sponsor with Grants Office. So Grants Office provides the expertise, they're providing the platform and the database of possible users. So another great example of how a vendor is trying to help their customers or their prospects. Next slide. I also want to recommend a place to look for grants. It is sponsored by CDWG. It's called getedfunding.com. It's free to use. And what's nice for educators is you can sign up by criteria that you choose. I'm teaching in a university, so I want only university level grants. I have these specific content areas or areas of focus. And you sign up that these are the things I want grant alerts, so you get an email. There's a new grant that's available that meets these criteria, and that's really helpful. There's also good database of grants to go look at that is kept updated. My criticism of many grant sites is there's so much outdated material, it's no good. But I find this one to be incredibly helpful. Next slide, please. Oops, we went backwards. We need to be going the other direction. I don't know what's happening here. Okay, the next one is one that's focused not for educators, but this is for vendors. It's called RFP Match. It does have a fee. It is not cheap. If you're a big company, it is an incredible investment in finding funding sources that fit with your product, that are by category, by state, and really wonderful advice. Dr. Paula Love, who runs this site, has been forever involved in this world of finding both federal and other funding, and has researchers who do a terrific job of finding materials. So if you don't know RFP Match, it's maybe 2 years old since it's been launched. I would strongly recommend that you go look at it if you are a vendor. She has another site, Grants Alert, that is aimed at educators, but I wanted to mention Get Ed funding since it's free, and then this one for vendors. Next slide, please. And so on the next slide, we should see a mention of local spending through the Funding Information Network. And this is an organization that sells databases and books on grants and foundations. Only 10% of American foundations have a website. So how do you find out who they are, and where they give away money? And this organization called Candid charges a large amount of money. However, there are what they call funding information network sites. So I just picked Indiana as a state. There are 8 of these sites in Indiana. You can go to these sites, which are typically in university or public libraries, and use their reference materials that you would pay thousands of dollars to access for free as long as you're in the site. If you walk outside the library, you will no longer connect to that site. They also offer workshops and help. Terrific, tremendous resource for you to be able to find information or to point some of your clients to. Next slide, please. Also wanted to mention local service clubs. Some of you may know these. These are not going to be big dollar items. They may be helpful for matches, or it may be that these are great for when you have that first school in the district that's done a pilot and wants to buy your product and can't afford it out of their budget. This is how you get that first one in, show great success, and then go after bigger funding. Next slide, please. And then I want to mention community foundations. In Indiana, every county has a community foundation, and there are also 3 statewide. And this is an easy way to get local money for local purposes. Typically, you will have to work through the school district grants office, or they may call it federal projects, because that's where they get the majority of their money from, is the federal government. But this is something that's been developed recently. And finally, I want to mention the session that's on this afternoon. The last session is about the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. And this is a terrific way. There may be up to $1 billion a year for hardware, software, teacher training, and all the things that are necessary. So if we could click on the next slide, That's a map of who is eligible, and you can zoom in. The government calls these low income and moderate income. This is kind of the banks paying back to low-income communities for doing redlining and not making home loans to people, and it's required by the federal government that banks do this. So this is a dedicated continuing source of funding that you can hear more about in the next session. And Patty, next slides are yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, Patty.
Perfect. I just wanted to give you some advice from the trenches, and I guess I represent the higher ed crowd here. So let me see if I can get going. Next slide. Okay, Rita and I have a long history together of collaborating, and I guess that's the key word for my particular part of this presentation, and that is collaboration. In higher ed, you know, there are sometimes monies that come down, and I've been really in the past proactive in attempting to find them. But a lot of times the opportunities come when partnering with someone else. And I just want to share a couple of the collaborations that we have been involved with and enjoyed. One of which is that I wanted to kind of emphasize is the professional development. That this was the first grant that I ever wrote. Actually, it was called Project Infusion. It was a trainer model, and it was really it was funded by the U.S. Department of Education. It was really helpful for training a whole bunch of teachers. We trained 180 teachers in 3 years, who then went out into their schools and trained others. And I think we came up with something like 350 to 400 teachers were ultimately trained. So it's a really great model to implement for higher ed. The one I'd really like to talk about today is the 5 partners for this $1 million grant that required a $1 million match. And it was really a collaboration between this private university I was working at the time, Stetson University, Bethune-Cookman, which is a historically Black college. And we were united in our efforts to provide professional development for pre-service teachers and for higher ed faculty, as well as K-12 teachers in the local school district in Daytona Beach, Florida. And the Florida Independent College Fund is a nonprofit that provides scholarships for students. And they agreed as part of their match to provide scholarships for all of the students, that graduates, K-12 teachers that we were working with for 2 graduate courses in integrating technology across the curriculum. And then one of our biggest funding sources, our match sources, was Bright House Network, which provided fiber for us to do video conferencing between schools in the district, which was about, I'd say, 35 miles away. And so that our pre-service teachers could do real-time teacher observations and as part of their field experiences. So that was a really fantastic collaboration, and it worked really well. I also wanted just to point out in this particular one, we asked for, this was applied for this at Southeastern, and we asked for $25,000, which is, you know, relatively speaking, not that much, but they offered to provide $7,500. And so we didn't make the top cut, but I was so glad that we decided to go ahead with this, because it became a collaboration between Notre Dame, Boston University, et cetera, and it was so valuable to network with other universities who were, you know, looking at researching the same things. And we actually were able, as a collaborative group, to present to a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C. on the value added by independent schools. So that was a really great opportunity for us, especially as a small university. Next slide. So collaborations can take all sorts of forms. I love to collaborate with local education agencies. A lot of times they get a lot more money than higher ed. So sometimes I'll be looking around at what's being funded and just approach the local school district with whom we have a great relationship and say, hey, there's this money coming down. Are you guys applying for it? What can we do? And so sometimes it really is helpful to be really proactive in terms of searching for money and also collaborating or proposing collaborations. We have been involved primarily in all of the grants that I've administered in providing professional development, either teachers or faculty at the higher ed level. So that's what we do. You can also include in your budget some materials and equipment. It's very, very, very seldom that you can ask for money strictly for equipment, but you can ask for the equipment that's needed to deliver your professional development. And then don't forget about companies and also foundations who can also partner with you. So collaboration is key. Next slide. So one of the things that I learned right away was that whoever is going to be the fiscal agent is the person that has a lot of responsibility. And you really need to decide that, especially when you have a collaboration of 5 or more partners, like the grant I was mentioning earlier. So whoever the fiscal agent is responsible for managing the budget, managing all the equipment, managing everything that comes in through the grant, and making sure that everything is done properly. So one of the things that I always recommend is to get the evaluator involved right away as you're writing the grant, so that you can have his or her input right away. And they can help you, especially with the assessment plan. I really think that many of our grants were funded because our assessment plans were really, really well developed. And of course, build your relationships. Who do you like to work with? And I keep a folder actually still on my computer of ideas for possible collaborations. You know, I look at grants as ways to get the things I need in order to accomplish the things I want. So if you view it in that way, then it doesn't seem so onerous when you have to go out and then finally write the grant. Next slide. So when you're writing, some people say that grant writing is fictional writing. I don't think so. To a certain extent, that may be true, but I really don't think so, because you have to, if you promise something, make sure you're able to deliver it. But you have to write persuasively. And if you're collaborating, like so-and-so's working on this section of the grant application and so forth, make sure that there's a central editor to move the grant forward so that it has a common voice. Make sure your budget aligns with reality. I've read for federal grants before in the past, and also state grants, and in many cases, the reader will turn directly to the budget. If the budget's out of line, they won't even read the actual text. So that if your budget's out of line, it's going to be problematic. I like to develop a work matrix to map out, and I'll show you a slide that depicts that in just a moment. But it helps to save space when you're writing a grant application. Usually they're 25 pages max, depending on the funding agent. And make sure you follow the grant application to the T, the guidelines to the T. If you're not eligible, you're going to spend all of your time. And if you're not sure that you're eligible, call the funding agent and see if there's a possibility even that you could apply. Make sure you find an external evaluator. And I love to build in costs for a website in order to publicize everything that you're doing. And that also helps to build the capacity of the institution that you're working for. If there are, there are ways of communicating and continuing the grant really after it's been defunded. So be sure to talk about how the grant will build the capacity of the organization to do their work effectively after the program is defunded. That's really important. Next slide. So here's an example of a work plan, and as you can see, it really helps to, first of all, reduce the amount of narrative that you have to write as you're writing the grant, but it also, in my mind at least, it says to the funding agent or the reader, this person has obviously administered before in the past, and also has done her homework in terms of what needs to be done before the grant starts. Try and build in 3 months of preparation and planning. A lot of times those state grants require you get the money and they said, oh, by the way, the grant started 3 months ago, and you're really scrambling. But if you have a really good proposal, you can gear up pretty quickly. And I think this is a very helpful tool. Next slide. I also like to build the budget carefully because, again, if the budget's out of whack, it's not going to work. So make sure, one of the things my university is really, really big on is make sure whenever you request money for grant that you cover the cost of the project investigator or the PI, because for FICA, because they don't pay that out of their pocket. And it's a small amount, but it adds up, especially if you're trying to build political capital at your university. I do recommend some type of administrative assistant for every budget that you administer, and also the FICA for them. Travel, you got to really make sure you don't have a bunch of travel taking up, even more than 20% of your budget lines, because that's always a red flag. They have software, the readers have software that can flag outstanding budget lines that require explanation or may require explanation. Next slide. And I wanted to talk a little bit about indirect costs. As you can see from this slide, you have the total direct cost for this particular application was almost $375,000. And the university had negotiated a indirect cost of 8%. That can vary from a typical, more or less typical 8%, and some grants don't allow any indirect costs at all, but those are the costs that are involved with copying, electricity, janitorial help, whatever is involved at the university in order to keep the grant running. And, the grant office, the provost office, whatever. So those indirect costs can be negotiated. Some universities have them as high as, 30 or 40%, which eliminates a lot of grant applications, I think, if they're so high. But one of the things I want to really caution you about with indirect cost is that you really need to ensure before we send off that grant, who's going to get those indirect costs? Where do they go? Are they going to go to the general operating fund, or are they going to go to the department or the college that received the grant? And you can eliminate a lot of hassles if you just have that in writing sometimes, if you need to indicate here's where these are going to be going if we get the funding, before you get the funding. So next slide. Oh, by the way, we didn't get that particular grant the previous slide because it was over budgeted, and that sometimes happens when you have a group of people developing the budget. Each one of them has a desire, so be aware. Okay, so one of the things I'll like to do before I submit is just do a little legwork to find out who's going to submit. Call the funding agent and ask who your competition is going to be. Make sure everybody is on board before the grant is sent off. And that especially applies to those budget lines for matching, because you don't want somebody to say, well, I never agreed to match this amount of money when you get the grant. It's very difficult. So make sure that everybody's signed off on the budget lines, including your university. Promise the moon, be sure you can deliver. And again, I'd like to have budget for administrative assistant and also a webmaster. They can be part-time, but you're going to need them to help. Most of the time, the grants were part and parcel of my faculty load. And so a grant can buy maybe 25% of your time, but that's about the max. Determine where the indirect costs will go, and there's no fighting. Next. Okay, and the last grant for administering, make sure that you have a way of continuing the efforts of the grant and the opportunities as best you can by either applying for an extension, applying for a different grant to augment or to continue the processes that started. And review the grant proposal. I like to review the proposal once a month in order to make sure that I'm meeting my timelines. Make sure you make those reports on time, submit them on time, and well done. Communicate with your partners frequently. And I like to hold semi-annual gatherings to just celebrate what's happening and what has happened and what's occurred. One of the hard lessons I learned with the grant that I mentioned at Stetson and Bethune-Cookman was that the fiscal agent, we were the fiscal agent of, all of the grant expenditures. So all of those equipment purchases, we purchased a lot of equipment, should be ordered, delivered to the lead institution, logged into the database, secured. We put LoJacks on the laptops that we sent out into the schools, and then you can disseminate to your partner school or organization so that there is a commonality. By the way, after that equipment was purchased, then you would have to, for the U.S. Department of Ed, we had to ask for it to remain at the universities where they were located or the schools that they were in. So don't forget to request that. Otherwise, it still belongs to the U.S. government. So that's all I have for now. I think we're going to open up things for questions.
Absolutely. Yes. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll be looking for those. And while I have you here, I just want to say thank you so much to our experts for their time and knowledge. And if you are looking for more information on what you've seen here today, be sure to visit their posters out in the expo hall where you can find links to where you can find these ladies. And we will have this recording available to view on our website shortly, so be on the lookout for that. I've also dropped some helpful links in the chat, so be sure to download those if you need them.
Great. Are you going to call for questions, Emily?
Yes, if anyone has any questions, they're free to drop them in the chat now.
Okay.
I haven't seen any come through so far.
Okay.
Emily, are you making copies of the slide deck available?
Is that okay with you, Rita and Patty?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, yes,
Okay.
we can share that into the chat then.
Yes, this will be dropped in the chat now.
Oh, Emily, you may want to mention that there were some additional documents that I included for resources.
Absolutely, yes. Those have also been dropped in the chat, but I can drop them in again in case anyone who joined us a little bit later didn't get access to that. One moment.
Great, thank you.
And the only thing I'd like to add to Patty's wonderful presentation is that if you're working through a school district, make sure that the people that you're working with, whether it's a principal, a department head, or a classroom teacher, is clearing things either with their principal of the school or through the grants office in the district, so that there's no surprises that the grant is received and it says they're going to purchase product XYZ as part of this grant, and the district has said, we will not buy anything that's not on this approved list, and the teacher doesn't know that. Or the principal is a little bit of a renegade, and there can be some real challenges and problems. The grants office will typically be incredibly helpful for someone who has done their homework and has done some legwork in finding some things, and then may say, well, you know, there's another funding source here. We've been looking for the right school to apply for. Let me help you with that. So if we didn't say that already, talk to the grants office or suggest to the client that they talk to the grants office. Is there a relationship between the grants office and the community foundation? Is there a school district foundation, which is something some of the school districts have set up? Not going to be a $1 million purchase, but again, it may be that first beachhead that you can establish with having a school that really wants your product and shine with that product before a district-wide purchase.
So true. Got to do your homework, and unfortunately the timelines for the announcement of the RF request for funding for proposal and the actual due date of the proposal is pretty short, and so there's a lot of legwork that has to be accomplished, especially, you know, getting those permissions, if you will, and making sure that everybody is on the same page, especially with budget.
And having said that, it's also often there will be the next year, there will be the same competition with almost exactly the same guidelines and a very similar deadline. So if you can't get in time for this year, it's possible that next year there will be an opportunity. And we have a question from Helena, as a teacher who writes grants, about sites that might still have funds available to support online learning. Without knowing more specifics, I would say go look at Get Ed funding. That would be the first place I would go look. And I would look to see if there's a community foundation in your community that might be able to support something like GoGuardian. You might also ask GoGuardian if they know of any funding sources for their product. You might be surprised. They might have some great suggestions for you as well. And good luck, Helena.
And if any of you guys have further questions, I would reach out to Patty or Rita directly. Patty, you teach a grant writing course, correct?
I do.
So yeah, if you guys wanted to take Patty's course, it's all online. So come over, contact her, get her contact info. These are both two amazing ladies, and they have a lot of experience and knowledge. So take advantage of it.
And if you're still interested in funding, again, we want to recommend the session that Bob McLaughlin and team will be doing on Community Reinvestment Act money, which is not something that's widely known, not been talked about very much. but is, I think, going to be a really game changer, particularly in communities where we found kids didn't have those devices and didn't have the connectivity to do learning from home in an age of COVID. And so while some of that federal money may be able to be spent for things like GoGuardian devices, internet access, there may be additional significant funding coming from the Banks of America